They know who you're dating. They know what you're doing on the weekend. They know which music you're into. And they, in a way, put together these pieces of your existence into like an understanding of who you are. It's not just that they know who you're dating, they also get a sense of, well, what is driving you? What motivates you in life? What are your dreams, your fears, your hopes, your aspirations? And in some way, the same way that algorithms now, when you think of recommendation systems or just like ads on social media, they use this understanding of who you are to just try and change your behavior. They're also in the business of meddling with people's lives, right?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of Through Conversations podcast, where we explore the truth through conversations with the most brilliant minds. And today, in front of me is Sandra Matz. Sandra, thank you so much for joining me. It's an honor.
Well, thank you for having me on the show today.
You just wrote a book that is mind bending. It's called Mind Masters. My team will show the cover here because we're entering an era, or I don't know if we're like very into it or not. It just seems like it keeps exponentially growing more and more about AI, data, privacy, if there's any privacy in this reality anymore, like our younger generations. And so there is this analogy where you start the book with the village analogy, and I love it. And I would love for you to share that with our audience now that's listening.
Yeah, no, happy to. I think the point of the entire book has always been, how do you make data relatable, right? How do you bring the topic of AI, machine learning that seems like very out there, black box, all based on equations? How do you make that relatable to the human experience? So the way that I think about this ability of algorithms to kind of take our data, learn something about who we are, and then potentially influence our behavior is that it's not that different from my experience of growing up in this village, of tiny village in the southwest corner of Germany, like 500 people. And the experience there of me growing up was that there was someone, like this community of people, right? You have 499 other people who know everything about your life. They know who you're dating. They know what you're doing on the weekend. They know which music you're into. And they, in a way, put together these pieces of your existence into like an understanding of who you are. It's not just that they know who you're dating, they also get a sense of, well, what is driving you? What motivates you in life? What are your dreams, your fears, your hopes, your aspirations? And in some way, the same way that algorithms now, when you think of recommendation systems or just like ads on social media, they use this understanding of who you are to just try and change your behavior. So it's not just that they're in the business of understanding their neighbors, but they're also in the business of meddling with people's lives, right? So they're not just trying to understand who you're dating; they're also trying to influence who you're dating. And sometimes that's amazing because they know you, and they can give great advice because they have an understanding of who you are and who you want to be. But it also oftentimes feels like they're pulling strings behind your back in a way that you don't have control over. So that's the analogy that is in a way showing that what we experience right now is not completely new. It's just different level.
It's, I feel like it's a 100x level
Yeah.
where it's just, it opens up, it's crazy because the question that I wanted to bring up, it's here perfectly, which is free will, the
Yeah.
whole aspect of what do we decide and how do we decide, and if we're empowered to make the best decisions for us. But at the same time, Sandra, it feels that all of these, you can speak more on this, but the North Star of gathering all of these data from all of us is not entirely that goodwill sense. It's just, it feels like it's more like consumer based. It feels like it's more, how can I meddle into your life for my own benefit? Does that
Yeah.
make sense, Sandra?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Free will is like a little bit higher level, right? Free will is essentially the question of, do we actually make our own choices, or is everything predetermined? So I wouldn't go as far as saying that these algorithms and AI technology takes away our free will, but it certainly influences the choices that we make. And I think one thing to notice is that we've always been influenced by other people and by the situations that we're in, right? I think anyone who has ever gone shopping hungry knows that our decisions that we make look quite different when we're hungry in the moment. You're probably not going to buy a ton of apples and vegetables. You're probably going to buy chips and chocolate because that's what your body is craving. And so this notion that we are fully in control of our own choices, I think that's always been a myth. But what I see in the technology space and what you're alluding to is this idea that the more I understand about who you are and potentially where you want to go, that gives me a lot of power in terms of influencing your choices. And sometimes most of the time, we're not even aware that that's happening, right? So most of the time, we're just exposed to content online or to like certain products and services, information, and we don't necessarily realize that this stuff is like very much personalized to who we are, and it's trying to accomplish a certain purpose, right? And you're absolutely right in that I think the way that we kind of see this play out right now is very much that it's like a one-way street, right? It's like back in the village, I knew something about you, you knew something about me, and we're using it to help each other. We're also using it to exploit one another. But it's like all in this confined space, and we're still playing the same game. I would argue that today, it's like totally different because it's a one-way street where you have companies collecting data, and as you said, they're typically using it in to benefit their bottom line. Right, that could be anything from keeping your attention, engagement, and eventually increasing profits. I do think that there's also a second side, and maybe we'll get to that later on. But you're absolutely right, and then I think that's a big difference to the village is that we're no longer playing on this level playing field. It's very much tilted towards the entities that capture data and exploit data, if you want.
Yeah, and the amount of data that we are just producing on a second basis just blew my mind. Reading it on Mind Masters, how you start your day and you're going for a walk, and how much data you're providing to everyone using Fitbit, using your phone. So can you talk about the size, the magnitude of how much data we
Yeah.
are really providing for all of these companies?
Yeah, and for me, it's both the volume of data, right? So what we know is like average person generates about 6 GB of data every hour. That's just an absolutely insane amount of data. And when you break it down, the interesting piece is that there's a lot of variety in the data that we generate. So some of it is your typical, what we would, as psychologists, would call identity claims. So those are all of the traces that you intentionally put out there because you want to show to yourself and the world, here's how I see myself, and here's the person that I want to be. And that's typically like social media, right? If you think about what is it that people put out on social media, it's like an expression of their lives. It's an expression of here's my preferences, my interests, and so on. And but that's only such a small part of the puzzle, and it's usually the part that gets the most attention in the media, right? If you look at conversations around data privacy or data being out there, like the social media companies are oftentimes front and center when it comes to that debate. But there's all of these other traces that we as psychologists would call behavioral residue. So those are traces that you don't intentionally put out there, but it's just like you interacting with technology that you're creating what I've called like this digital footprint. And that ranges anywhere from your Google searches, right? You type questions into Google search bar that you probably wouldn't feel comfortable asking your closest friends and sometimes even partner. Then there's your phone that you mentioned. Your phone, you think about it, it's something that's with you pretty much 24/7. Based on all of the sensors that are embedded in the phone, it knows where you are because that's a GPS sensor, right? So it knows exactly where you live. It knows where you work. It knows where you are at any given point in time, probably who you meet because that's phones showing up in the same place, sometimes repeatedly. It knows who you're talking to. And there's your credit card. So even if you left your phone at home, most of the time you swipe your credit card, which gives us a sense of your daily routines, what you buy, what you're interested in. So there's all of these traces. And then obviously there's cameras that are scattered around cities. So I think in New York, there's no way that you can get from lower Manhattan to upper Manhattan um, without, if you don't want to be seen by a camera, you'd have to swim through the Hudson River. So there's just no way of escaping this, what I think of as like tracking, right? Even if you said, I'm not going to use social media anymore, you would literally have to live out there somewhere in the woods and grow your own vegetables for you to not be traced by some of these technologies. So it's like it's both the volume that I think is mind blowing, but it's also just the richness of the data, which has like all of these different puzzle pieces of your life.
Yeah, and one thing that really interests me while reading Mind Masters was how our personality traits do nudge us into, well, nudge what we really see on the internet more than we think of. For example, if I'm very conscientious and industrious, I will see maybe an ad of someone working hard, like plowing on the field. But if I'm someone who's very open, I might see like a sculpture of Da Vinci. So how the richness of that data, how is it, puzzled together to make the profile of who Alex is?
Yeah. And so you're touching on a really important point because for me, again, coming back to this analogy of the village, it's not just that I can peek into your psychology, right? That in and by itself is fascinating for behavioral scientists, but it's really the second step of I can then use these insights. Once I understand your motivation, your fears, hopes, and so on, I can actually use it to change your behavior. But kind of taking a step back to how do algorithms make sense of these data, right? So I think that's for me the interesting part as a psychologist, which I also think is why people relate to this topic and this type of research is we don't think about ourselves in like these scattered data points, right? If I remember like when I told my friends and my parents, my family about, well, look, there's someone who can capture your location at any given point in time, they were like, okay, there's like someone in their database now has like longitude and latitudes. Maybe they know what I bought at the grocery store, but how intimate at the end of the day is it really? Once you tell them, well, a computer can actually turn this into predictions of whether you might be impulsive, whether you might be neurotic, your political ideology, your sexual orientation. It's suddenly this just feels a lot more intimate, right? Because that's how we think of ourselves. And those are typically things that we don't necessarily put out there for the world to see without restrictions. And so the way that computers make these kind of links between what we do to who we are is that it's based on machine learning, right? It's like you give them a lot of examples. So I could give a computer a lot of examples that says, here's how someone's spending record is related to their personality. And then by trial and error, it just figures out, okay, if someone actually spends a lot of money on going to bars and doing like all of these social things, maybe they're a bit more extroverted. And if they spend money on home improvement and gardening, maybe they're a little bit more introverted. And the interesting part for us as psychologists, which also makes them just such master snoopers compared to humans, is that because they see all of this data in an unbiased way, right? They don't have an incentive to kind of think in a certain way or make predictions in a certain way that benefits them. They just look at the data and bottom up try to see what are some of the patterns, which sometimes gives them an edge over human judgments, right? So there's like this example that I love, which told us psychologists something about how human behavior works that we didn't know before, which is the use of first person pronouns. So when you talk a lot about like I, myself, me, so references to the self, um, I think what I remember this conference where one of the very eminent psychologists in that space just asked the audience, again, room full of psychologists, what do you think the use of first person pronouns is related to? And all of us, our best guess was it has to be narcissism. But like if you talk about yourself, you're probably a narcissist. Turns out not the case. And what it is a signal of is actually emotional distress. So people who use first person pronouns more, they have a higher likelihood of suffering from depression, anxiety. And this is something that wasn't immediately intuitive, but then when you step back and you think about it, it's like, yeah, of course, like if you don't feel good about yourself, the one thing that is in your mind is not how do I solve the world's problems, right? You don't think about how to fix climate change and so on. What you think about is why am I feeling so bad? How do I get better? And this inner monologue then creeps into the language that we use. And for me, this is like one of these examples where machines, just by looking at all of this data and making these empirical connections, can teach us something about human psychology that we might not know. And obviously, then in the second step, also gives other people a lot of power over influencing how you think, feel, and show up in the world.
Wow. Yeah, it's that's the bright side. The first part of it's the bright side, like
Yep.
allowing allowing us to have a better understanding of how we behave in the world and why is it that we behave this way. But then it takes me to the second part of what we were saying, Sandra, which is it can be used to meddle a lot on our lives. And I think the extreme scenario of this is just how the social credit system in China works, right? That you
Yeah.
discussed on that. Every single move, AI recognition, facial recognition, they all your behavior literally defines what you can do and can't do.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem that we're in the US that's the case, but do you feel that such a you know access to who we are maybe is doing so in an implicit way, like it's not explicit as China is?
Yeah. I mean, I think very much so. So first of all, I think this is already happening, right? So it's not, I don't like, I mean, China is extreme in the sense that if they predict that you have a high likelihood based on your data to voicing dissent, you might not be allowed to Beijing because the government is too worried that you're going to go protest and try to take down the government. So I don't think we're there yet in the US, but there's certainly kind of steps towards this dystopian future, right? And at the basic level, it just means that the choices are no longer your own. If I kind of repeatedly target you with ads that are meant to get you to buy a certain product, even if you want that product in the end, it just means that it's no longer your own choice. There's certainly contexts in which, if I predict, for example, that you're less conscientious and more neurotic, more anxious, maybe I'm going to opt your insurance premium. Maybe if I understand that you are more impulsive and you're the type of person who might not actually pay back their loan, either it's going to get more expensive or you don't get it at all. So I think there's all of these steps where um, my prediction of who you are is either opening doors, right? Sometimes if I think you have something that I desire, maybe that's going to make it more likely that you get something that you want. But if I think you're someone that has a profile that's not as desirable, that's probably going to close some doors. And for me, this discussion is a really interesting one that I oftentimes have in the classroom. When I kind of talk about social scoring, there's usually at least one person who raises their hand and says, like, well, but that's happening in China. And I don't feel worried about my data because I have nothing to hide. So if the government collects my data and if companies collect my data, I feel pretty okay about that. And it's a very privileged position to be in, right? First of all, that doesn't apply to everybody. And it also doesn't mean that it's going to be true for you tomorrow, because it just needs to be a change in leadership, either companies or government, and that could be kind of completely overturned. I think in the US, the closest example that also hit close to home was the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe versus Wade. So suddenly, certain states in the US were free to ban abortion rights, right? So now, suddenly overnight, women had to worry about their data being out there, like as Google searches, where you could kind of track, was like, okay, here's probably someone who was pregnant who's trying to get an abortion. And maybe also based on your GPS records and your travel records, we see that you're traveling across states. Based on your purchases, we see that you're not buying any baby stuff. So there's all of these data traces that can give you a pretty intimate insight into whether someone might be pregnant and might have tried to get an abortion elsewhere. So this is just one example, right? I think where people in the US that felt somewhat protected suddenly woke up to this reality. It was like, yeah, oh, actually my data is permanent once it's out there, but the leadership who decides what happens with the data isn't. And for me, it's a really critical piece of the puzzle that should make us care about privacy, even if in the here and now we feel perfectly fine and protected.
Yeah, 100%. And it's I have two questions. Let's tackle the first one first, which is it seems that I'm part of Gen Z, my generation and millennials, sort of. It seems that that's the sentiment throughout that. I don't. What's privacy nowadays? I
Yeah,
love posting myself out there. I love posting my selfies, my tweets, all of
yeah,
it. So there seems to be this notion that we don't understand the magnitude and importance of having a private life. And that in itself is driving this conversation like, hey, they're open to it. Just let's keep plowing. Let's keep doing it. So
yeah.
what's the first thing that you say to Gen Z when they say, privacy? Nah, I don't care. Let them say
And
whatever they want.
millennials, right? So I'm a millennial, and I actually understand the sentiment because it feels like an uphill battle. And I think that it's the what our mind jumps to, and like the examples that you mentioned is like, yeah, of course, if you have control and you put something out there on social, that's your decision to do. Now, still, like it could be that this is going to be abused in the future. For me, one of the helpful thought experiments is think about the offline equivalents, right? Like if I say your phone tracks your GPS records continuously and knows exactly what you do at any given point in time, that's like having a stalker walk behind you 24. That person would go to jail, and I doubt that you would feel super comfortable having that person walk behind you 24/7. Now, you might be fine saying like, okay, this person sees what I put out there on my poster about my life and like the speech that I gave about what I had for lunch, which is like what we post on social media, but you probably wouldn't feel great about them kind of trying to figure out everything about you in a way that you have no control over. Same with the messages that you send, right? Imagine like the mailman going through your letters, if you still know what those are, um, and just reading those. That person again would go to jail. So there's like, and if you think about the offline equivalents of everything that we do online, and all of the traces that again we don't really intentionally put out there, I think that really kind of highlights the point of why privacy, we still care about it. I think the problem that we have is right now in the online world, it's a trade-off that we have to make, right? It's a choice that I have to make that says either you care about your privacy and then you can't use the products at all. So if you really don't want to, if you want to protect your privacy, you don't use social media, you don't use a credit card, you don't use a phone. If that's the choice that we have, obviously the brain is going to pick, I'm going to stick with the phone, I'm going to stick with social media, and I'm going to stick with my credit card because that's convenient. There's just no way of living modern life without all of these gadgets. So the solution that I've been thinking about a lot is how do we eliminate this trade-off, right? We can't just put the burden on Gen Z and millennials and say, well, you grow up and try to do a better job protecting your privacy because it's impossible. What we need is like these technologies that say, well, can I give you the same service, convenience, personalization, ability to communicate what you want to the world without having the risk of your data being abused? And there are technologies that do that, right? I think there's one of the ones that I discuss in the book, which I think a lot more people should know about, is called federated learning, which is the idea that for you to benefit from the intelligence that companies provide, right? Netflix. We all benefit from Netflix making recommendations because there's so many movies that you just never you would never be able to find what you're looking for if you were doing it all by yourself. So we benefit from Netflix understanding our interests. But there's a world in which you could say, well, instead of Netflix collecting all of my data, understanding who I am, training their model centrally to kind of improve their recommendations, what they could do is they could say, well, we have this intelligence. We know that someone who likes Titanic also likes Love Actually, and someone who likes RoboCop also likes Terminator. We're going to send this intelligence to your phone or to a local device where your data sits. So your data essentially sits on your phone, never leaves that safe harbor, but it locally updates. So because your phone is a supercomputer, your phone is essentially so much more powerful than the computers that we used to launch rockets to space with a few decades ago. So you can take Netflix's intelligence, send it to the phone, update locally, so it now understands based on the movies that you've watched that there's also other movies that go with Love Actually and Titanic. What you do is you send the intelligence back to Netflix. So we still all benefit. I benefit from you watching a lot of movies because the recommendation system gets better. But I don't need your data for that to sit in the central server. I can just have it locally. And that's a way in which I think we can get around this burden of saying, well, you just need to understand what data you want to share, what you don't want to share, and manage it yourself. Because that's an uphill battle that we're, I think, really not equipped to take on.
Yeah, 100%. That was one of my questions, which was, how can us as individuals really reduce our digital footprint? But like you say, it's an uphill battle, and it makes me think a lot on what you just said. That there's in tech overall, I feel that there's always this Trojan horse strategy, right? Like I'm
Mhm.
trying to provide you like a service.
Yeah.
Let's say, just to provide a silly example, is just download this PDF, but I retrieve your email address, right?
Yeah.
This sort of thing, or use our game for free, but I'm gonna sell your data to third parties
Yeah.
that will profile you for loans, which is a bit less silly of an example. So I just it's my question is just, there's how can we be how can we use these uh, resources to, or these apps and everything, just without having that, it just feels like it takes a piece of our soul every time we use those, and
And you
it's
don't even notice it, right? So I think that's the
exactly.
problem. It takes a piece of your soul and it kind of gives others so much power over your behavior without you even being aware of that. And I think you're absolutely right in that that's what I mean. Like if because it's so not visible, right? It's not visible what's going to happen with your data, at least to most people. And even if it is, it's a full-time job. But if you constantly have to say, well, but I don't want this, and then I can't use the service, it's never going to happen. So I think what we kind of almost need to flip it in a sense that your data is protected until you tell me otherwise, right? So right now, most of it is an opt out. Most of it says, well, we're going to do all of this stuff. And yes, we're not forcing you. Here's a way for you to opt out of the tracking, which already is an advancement, which most of the time doesn't happen, right? Most of the time, it's an either or choice. Either you give us all of the data, you use the product, or just leave it and goodbye. But even this like opting out, it just means it puts the burden on you as a consumer. And we have better stuff to do than opting out. So you can imagine if this was flipped and most of the services through regulation, right, were not allowed to collect your data until you tell them to do so. Now they would actually be in a position where they have to deliver real value to you. Right now, it's so easy for companies to do like this lip service and say, well, we need your data for this product to function. It's like, there's no way for me to see if that's actually true, right? There's no way for me to see here's what it would look like if not. Now, if you flip it and you say, well, it's an opt-in, now you really have to show me that you using my data actually improves the service. And YouTube is an interesting example because YouTube, you can turn off the history, right? So you can say, don't use my previous history to make these recommendations. And I think a lot of people actually realize that in a way sucks. Like if you kind of completely eliminate like the understanding of who you are, it's like it's a nuisance to continuously start from scratch. So I think even if we kind of if we switch to an opt-in, it would even show consumers like here's the value. And again, ideally, YouTube would actually do what I said before in terms of federated learning, where instead of saying, well, either you give us all of your data, then you get the good experience, they could say, well, we're just going to send the intelligence to you again, like completely eliminating this trade-off. So I think I always think about this, like, how do you make it easy for people? And there's this metaphor that I really like in this space is like, if you want to change behavior, it's like launching a rocket to space. What you need is thrust, and that's motivation. And I would argue that most people actually, if they had the choice, they would probably go for the one that gives them both the service, convenience, and privacy. So I don't think it's always a motivation problem. The problem is friction. That if you want to launch a rocket to space, you also need to reduce friction as much as you can. And that's the opposite of what we're currently doing. Right now, it's incredibly difficult for people to do the right thing. So I think that's like it's a simple principle and it's not very specific, but it guides so many of the ways that I'm thinking about it in terms of like using technologies like federated learning or kind of having these like switching from opt out to opt in. That I think it's just a useful guide to make these decisions.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to interrupt this episode. I have a huge announcement that I'll be sharing with you just now. My first book ever is out now, called The Time Is Now, a guide to honor your time on Earth. This was a 2-year project that's been in the works. It's a tough love guide to honor your time on Earth. This book will show you how to reclaim your time and energy for what truly matters. Click the link in the show notes and you're gonna see also the link to the domain here, timeisnowbook.com. Order a copy for your loved ones, and I'm so excited for you to dive into it. Thank you. Yeah, and listen, personalization in itself, we're driving towards that very rapidly. But again, like you discussed now, Sandra, there's this big trade-off, and that it feels like for me to show you who you are, I also need to know who you are so I
Mhm.
can meddle with your life. And it's I'm when I see an application or just a platform or a service that says, we don't sell your data to third parties, like this is not a Trojan horse service.
Yeah.
It's much more, you know, you become loyal to the service itself more. You're like, okay, so at face value, they're being transparent. They're showing that they don't want to use us to, continue their own quest for greed and for money.
Yeah.
And so, are you seeing that pattern more in the services that are appearing, especially now with AI? How ads are being used with AI? I know you discussed that a lot,
Yeah.
but are you seeing that tilting into the right direction or more into that dystopian version of this is going to exponentially just become even more crazy than it is?
I think you could actually go both ways, and it probably is going to go in both extremes. But you're absolutely right. So one of the points that I constantly make when I talk to companies and I discuss like here's how I would do it if I were you, is make it part of your value proposition, right? So there's like involving the consumer and saying, here's how we're better than the competition on this front. And not just that, we actually allow you to fully play with here's the data that you want us to use, here's the data that you don't want us to use, engage with the profile that we create about you, because these predictive models they're good, right? They're like pretty accurate on average, but they constantly make mistakes, and it's costly for the company because if I have a wrong understanding of who you are, it's frustrating for you, but I'm also going to lose a lot of money because now I'm investing into something that's not even true. And you do see companies pivoting in this direction, right? And it's usually a B2C, so business to customer companies. Apple, like Apple, if you walk like through New York, like most of the ads that Apple has now are is like we're the ones protecting your privacy. Right. And for them it makes sense because the end customer is the consumer. Like if you're Facebook or like one of these other platforms, that's much harder because you're B2B, right? So the consumer is the product and you're selling them to other companies to advertise to. So for them, this idea that we're the ones sponsoring privacy is much harder. But I really kind of believe that if, like, even from a strategic business point of view, if you're not in the business of selling data, right? If you're not one of the Facebooks of this world and you're just using it to provide better service, you are actually much better off not collecting the data, right? Because like once you can think of data collection as like sitting on this pile of gold. Take the healthcare space. Like healthcare data is like genetic data is so sensitive, financial data, it's so sensitive. And like once you collect it, you better make sure that it's protected, right? So you're spending a ton of money on security. Um, and there's a huge financial risk to data breaches. There's a huge reputational risk to data breaches. Now, oftentimes companies are willing to take that risk because they know that they need the data to offer the better service. But again, that's no longer true. You can offer the same service without collecting the data. What you need is need to set up this infrastructure initially that says, well, we're just using this different type of learning and machine intelligence that's not operating in our central server, but it's operating locally on people's devices. And now you're in a spot where you don't have the same financial and reputational risk of data breaches because you never collect the data in the first place. You can use it as part of the value proposition, as you mentioned, right? You can make this a selling point and say, we truly care about your privacy and we truly care about you being able to hold on to your data. So here's what we're offering. And this is much better than what the competition offers. So I think, again, like, because oftentimes there's pushback from companies to say, like, well, but we need the data and the data is what makes it valuable. It's not true. It's not the data. It's the insights that you can derive from the data to make your services better. So I totally agree. I think we're going to see some of the companies shift. Still think that there's going to be a lot of bad actors in the space, right, that try to use AI to exploit us in a way that's easier and more scalable.
Yeah, we'll definitely expand on the AI equation that you discuss on a lot. But this brings me to part of like perhaps the darkest part of our conversation that you've discussed also in Mind Masters and throughout, Sandra, which is, I've alluded to the question regarding why privacy is important, and we discussed, we don't want a stalker stalking us all the time offline. But then I think about, right now what's happening in the world, especially with, anti-Semitism and what's happening, rise of hate speech, whatnot, reminds me of what you've discussed on how data was used in the 1930s
Yeah.
and how literally privacy costs people's lives. So I would love for you to share on this, dark alley that we need to discuss.
And I think so for me, this is one of the examples that, like I said earlier, how people sometimes come back and say, well, I don't care about my privacy because I have nothing to hide. And for me, that's one of these cringe-worthy examples. It gives you goosebumps that I think goes a long way in showing people you don't know what tomorrow holds. So this is back in the 1940s, I guess, when Nazi Germany was going through all of the European countries trying to track down members of the Jewish community, right? And there was this huge difference in terms of atrocities among the Jewish community as a function of whether religious affiliation was part of the census data. So you can imagine that there were countries where religious affiliation, all you had to do was to come in, go to City Hall, get the records, find the names and address, and go and find the members of the Jewish community. And there were other countries where that was not the case. And the level of atrocities across these countries were vastly different. Now, if you fast forward, first of all, what we see in the US right now with Elon Musk and his team coming in, trying to get access to all of the personal files from all of the federal employees is not too dissimilar, right? So they might not have the same intentions, but there's certainly kind of this idea that, well, we don't know who's going to have access to these very, very intimate parts of our identity that we didn't think we're going to have access to just like a few months ago. So there's that. And the other thing is that now you could actually predict a lot of these things from data, right? I don't necessarily need census data anymore to predict your religious affiliation, your sexual orientation, which again, in many parts of the world is still punished with the death penalty. I think people in the US oftentimes forget how these different parts of your identity are just a lot more dangerous in other parts of the world. And so all you need is access to, let's say, data from Facebook, data from Google. And you can argue that, well, it would be hard for governments to get hold of the data. I don't think so. I don't think so because, first of all, the heads of those companies might collaborate with different regimes, right? I think the picture that we saw of President Trump surrounded by all of the tech moguls was just kind of scared the shit out of people, rightfully, I think. And if not, even if they said look, we're not going to collaborate if you're doing something that is so outside of our value system that we can't support, it's very easy to replace them. If you kind of look back to the 1940s in Germany, most of the people who kind of showed resistance, they were just taken out of the game. And it's very easy to replace a CEO and then just kind of go in and replace them with people who are a lot more willing to share data. So for me, it really comes back to this one line that I have in the book, which I like, is data is permanent, but leadership isn't. And that's how we should be treating it, right? We should be treating it as whatever data is collected today, what would this look like if tomorrow we had someone in charge, either for the company or a government, that was trying to prosecute and the pieces of our identity that I carry? And to me, it's the very dark side, but I think it's a way of thinking that is necessary. And you actually, and then we can move on, but I do think that some of the companies actually realize that. So I have a lot of friends in the tech companies, and I think they want more regulation because a lot of them say look, there's only so much we can do without regulation because it's like a horse race and it's a competition. So if they collect the data, we also kind of somewhat have to collect the data to kind of justify in front of our shareholders. Totally different problem. But essentially, they are hoping for someone to say, let's just make it harder for everybody to abuse some of these data points. And Apple has an interesting thought experiment that they go through with their teams, which is essentially saying, they call it the evil Steve test. So in reference to Steve Jobs, they say, well, we kind of, let's say we're building this product, we're all excited, we think it's going to improve user experience, and we're really doing it with a very benevolent take, right? We're kind of there to help consumers. But let's go through this thought experiment and think about what would happen if tomorrow we got a completely new CEO with completely different values. They were not in the benevolent business. They were trying to exploit and harm our users. Would we still feel comfortable collecting the data right now, knowing that we're going to have someone who has these completely different values? And if the answer is no, well, then you should probably go back to the drawing board and try to do better. So that's, I think, a nice way of thinking about the future that might not look as bright.
Wow. Yeah, it's thank you for that. It's just very, very enlightening, to be honest. And we don't really understand, when everything happened, as now just with the rise of anti-Semitism, we saw how
Mhm.
23andMe was hacked specifically for a certain portion of Ashkenazi Jews.
Yeah.
And it's just like you think you're using this service for your own good, and all of a sudden you're exposed to using that. And another example, which is simple, perhaps more for Gen Z, is the dating apps. I read that dating
Yeah.
apps, if you ask for your data, they provide 100-page long of all of your preferences and all of the information that you have, even more information that you know about. So
Yeah.
using a dating app. So this is just to say, to your point, to echo your point, that how how come the government won't have access to 300, 400 pages of all of who you are? And that in itself, while maybe the intentions right now are good, maybe the leadership right now is good, that in itself will remain locked in a file for the next administration.
Yeah.
And so that's a lot to think about.
And there's also, I mean, there's like buying data is so cheap these days, right? If I wanted to get a file on who you are, like your address, your email, your phone number, again, any kind of the social demographics plus preferences and so on, all you have to do is go to a data broker, pay maybe $1, and you get this entire. It's like it's insanely cheap, and it's dangerous. And I think there's like one interesting example which shows that there is a certain level of understanding. So there was this case of a judge in New Jersey, whose son was actually killed because a former, like someone she litigated against, actually bought her file, like bought an entire dossier on her, kind of figured out where she lives, what her life looks like, and so on, showed up at the doorstep, and then because she wasn't there, instead actually shot her son. And there's now, so this is like this led to a piece of legislation which is now protecting judges from being part of these data broker registries. So if you're a judge, you're somewhat protected because the government thinks that there is potential harm to your data being used. Now, if that applies to judges, it should apply to all of us. Right? So there's so many other professions where you could easily imagine someone coming in, getting all of this data to try and track you down and potentially harm you. And judges are certainly not the only profession. So I think if we've taken the step of saying we understand the data is potentially harmful, but we're only going to apply this to judges, there's like this fundamental piece missing. We're like, well, if they're protected, why not all of us?
Yeah. And this brings me to, at least this administration that currently has joined the White House, Trump's administration, they're removing a lot of regulations. And on one hand, it does seem promising because there's going to be a boom in innovation. But on the other, you've alluded to regulation and how other tech leaders are saying we need to protect this. And so, on your perspective, Sandra, how do we draw this perfect middle between, let's let them loose, let's bring innovation, let's foster creativity, but at the same time, not on the at the cost of privacy, not at the cost of someone's well-being.
Yeah. I mean, for me, the one of the really interesting examples is DeepSeek, right? So
Mm.
DeepSeek with a new language model, why did they come up with a better way and a cheaper way and a more efficient way? Is because there were constraints. So I think this notion, if we have regulation, we're stifling innovation and we're kind of we're hurting the private sector. I don't think that's always true. I think once you have constraints that says here's some norms, here's some fundamental principles that we care about as a society, that just should inspire companies to do better, right? So like the way why was federated learning invented? Because it was like, well, here's actually a problem that we're trying to solve, and I would call that innovation. I think like the same with blockchain. Like why did people come up with blockchain? Is because there's like we don't trust central entities, and I think there's a way in which we can kind of change this narrative of well, it's regulation versus innovation. I don't think that's true. I think oftentimes constraints in regulation actually breed innovation almost by necessity. And I think DeepSeek, again, is one of these examples in the last couple of months that for me exemplify. It's not constrained by regulation, but it's certainly constrained by what they were able to do with the materials that they had access to. So I think it's a false dichotomy that it's regulation or innovation.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned DeepSeek because, well, yes, it's I do see how they managed to create something amazing, but at the same time, it is affiliated to the whole Chinese government, to the whole social credit system, and so in itself, it does beg the question: what are the regulations trying to favor off? Because if I type, and I've seen this plenty of times, but if I type on DeepSeek, you know, uh, can you tell me how's the well-being of the Uyghurs in China?
Yeah.
It shuts
Great.
down. Yeah, I can't answer that. So
And I mean, that's also why is the US government worried about TikTok, right? It's not that it's just like we're collecting your data. It's we're worried about them influencing opinion. And that can take many different forms. That's sometimes omission. So the case that you gave is essentially saying, well, the moment that we control the flow of information, we can omit certain facts that we don't want to be out there. And the other one is amplification. Is like, well, once we control the flow of information, we can make sure that the ones that we want you to see are actually being amplified. And for me, the scary part is like the combination of there's someone who kind of can put their own incentives into an algorithm. Plus, it's so fragmented because it's so personalized that we don't have collective oversight anymore, right? If you think back to, now again, 1940s, there was always propaganda. There was always propaganda of saying, yeah, we're going to suppress the discourse of certain topics and we're going to amplify certain topics. But at least what we had back then was the ability to talk about it, right? Because you heard or saw the same propaganda as me, and maybe we bought into it, but there was still an option to say, well, actually, this just doesn't make any sense. What do you think about it? We don't get this opportunity anymore because what you see on TikTok and Instagram and wherever is just so completely different to what I see. And because we know that it's different, we oftentimes don't assume that we can talk about these things together as like a collective insight. And for me, that's the really worrying part, is that there's like people meddling with what we see, but we can't really have a checks and balances that is like this collective oversight anymore.
yeah, that's a brilliant point. Because, for example, my algorithm shows me French bulldogs, some doom scrolling, and some baseball, and then every news now and then. And it's like you say, it's my own echo chamber of my own
Yeah.
self, not only just of my group of friends. It's just I'm living in a different online reality than you, and so there's not a consensus to discuss.
I think that makes it, in a way, so I think it's for me, it's like dangerous in terms of creating this shared reality, right? So in a way, why did or like democracies are based on this idea that there's discourse, right? So we can talk about ideas and the best ideas win because we're kind of arguing out. It's just not, that's no longer happening. So for me, it's both the breakdown of shared reality, and then if you take it to a somewhat maybe less dystopian world, but equally important, I also think it's like this breakdown of culture, right? I was thinking the other day is like, if everything that you see is so different to what I see, you could imagine this world where your James Bond movie looks totally different to my James Bond movie because AI can generate it like on the fly based on what I know about you. Well, maybe that feels nice because it taps into some of the things that you're excited about, but we don't have anything to talk about. Like the culture is built on us making sense of the world together. And I'm really worried that we're losing this ability to just have these moments where we say, hey, what did you think about this movie and this scene and so on? And for me, that's one of the real dangers.
Yeah, I never thought about that actually. Like, I'm all in favor of personalization, but the cost in itself might be that there's not a collective understanding of what are we doing on this earth.
Yeah. And why do you watch movies, right? The
Yeah.
reason for why it's so fun to watch movies is because you can talk about it. So I think the fact that we feel more lonely than ever is partly due to that, because we don't have these like common topics to talk about anymore. It's like I see something, you see something, and maybe it's personalized, but it doesn't allow us to have fun discussions around it.
Yeah, that was one of my questions regarding also AI for you,
Mm.
Sandra, which is, this loneliness pandemic that we're seeing, this atomized society that we're discussing now, and having access to a readily open, non-judgmental AI machine saying,
Mm.
uh, embracing what I'm saying, just understanding, just allowing me to vent out.
Mm.
How do you feel about this? Also, related to the James Bond trailer that you said,
Right.
I've seen the trailer that was made with AI in
It's
itself,
insane.
which is insane. But how is this influencing, the social fabric of of offline world of
Yeah.
interactions?
I mean, I think there's actually two sides. I do think that there is a more promising side, right? So there's many people who really need support in the moment,
Yeah.
and they don't get it. So I think according to the World Health Organization, for every 100,000 people looking for mental health support, there's 13 professionals. So human professionals, right? There's a huge gap in supply and demand. So if I think about people who are like in these acute kind of emotional struggles, I think AI has an enormous potential to help them. Now, the problem that I think you're alluding to, which I 100% agree with, is if we have a conversation partner that is trained to just be nice and agree and do like everything it can to make us feel better, I think we might be losing our ability to have hard conversations. And sometimes, first of all, the human world is messy, right? So you're very rarely going to find a counterpart that just says yes to everything that you say and is just like 100% supportive, doesn't have any needs themselves, and so on. So the world is messy, and difficult conversation is also what makes us kind of get better over time, right? Like if we never had disagreements, we would never innovate. We would never come up with new ideas because all we just kind of say is like we stick to what we know. So I agree that if there's no balanced kind of, yeah, sometimes when I really need it, I talk to the AI and all I want to hear is, oh my God, I'm so sorry to hear that this deer have going through such a hard time, and just kind of reinforce like my feelings and help me get out of the difficult situation. But sometimes I also want to have this more messy reality that makes it difficult, and there's friction, and the friction eventually in the long run makes us better. So I think that we kind of need to find a balance, and it's not easy, right? So I now have a 1-year-old son, and I already kind of think about, well, like how do I make sure that he still has human friends? How to make sure he's not just glued to his phone and just kind of talks to people who don't really exist. So I don't have a great solution. I think I just have a concern that I share with you.
Yeah. And that, I think that brings me to, I think, my second to last question, Sandra, which is, what is that difficult conversation we should be having, not only in the individual level in terms of privacy, but also as a companies, as a collective, and the online world? What's that conversation we need to really focus on, and how do we get there?
Yeah. So I mean, the broader conversation I think is kind of coming back a little bit to your innovation question. Is like, what are we innovating for? Right? So there's constantly like, well, but if we have regulation and we do this and this and this, that's going to stifle innovation. It's like, okay, but what does innovation serve? If innovation is supposed to serve us and make us better individually and collectively, then innovating for the sake of innovation might not be the solution. The same is true for like this idea of like, and I like growth, right? Is like, and I work in a business school, but this idea that the only thing that we're aiming for is constant growth, that just kind of bugs me so much. You could have a business that is doing extremely well, is very profitable, and it's kind of serving consumers. Why does it have to kind of grow? If that's the only thing we're optimizing for, I think it's not so surprising that the incentives that we're kind of creating are not always aligned with what we want to see as a society. So I think those two conversations of like, is there a way to think about it in a different way? Is there more than just the shareholders who have a financial interest, right? So like, who are the stakeholders? Can we kind of factor their interests in somehow in a marketplace? And it's not easy. I don't have a great solution, but those are at least the questions that I want people to think about. And then the other part is really this innovation piece. Is like, innovation is great, but innovation is supposed to serve us,
Mhm.
and not just like a handful of people who make more money. So what are we really trying to optimize for there?
Yeah, you touched on 100% subscribe to that, which is, what is the North Star of all of this? It really, when I read your book and when
Yeah.
I read about privacy and about technology, it's just, what is the ultimate goal here? What are we trying to achieve? Is it more shareholder value? Is it more bottom line profit? Like, there's more to our humanity, no?
Yeah.
Like, just, there's much more than just making a profit of data. And that's, it's something that really boils me. Like, I
I hope
really,
your generation is gonna think about it differently. That's my optimism comes from you guys. It's just like, I think there's people are thinking about it slightly differently. It's not going to be easy, right? Because there's always going to be people who are pushing for like the old models and who benefit from the old models. But I hope that there's enough of you with loud voices.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna do all of my part. I do see that
Yeah.
I I don't know. When I see it within my generation, like people my age, not maybe not necessarily the ones who are building stuff, but maybe just those who are consuming.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel as though they understand the consequences of this long term. They understand what's really at stake and why privacy is also important, not only for myself, but also, hopefully one day when I have kids, they'll see my
Yeah.
digital footprint. They'll see my podcasts. They'll see my conversations. They'll see what I'm writing on. And it's like just to honor your own self, right? Just the internet doesn't have to be just a thing that you need to just throw out whatever thoughts.
Yeah.
Just do it more mindfully. So I'm
Yeah.
hoping that, these conversations do enlighten my generation more.
I also feel like it's you can almost think of it as a question of, are you being kind and generous? Right? Because it's not just about yourself, as you said. It like I oftentimes go through this thought experiment of like how, or like I encourage executives to go through this thought experiment of like, if you're using data in a certain way, like how would you feel if your daughter, if your spouse, if your like someone that you love was on the receiving end, right? If they were actually the consumer, and if you feel like it's like a little bit icky, then maybe you should be doing better. So I think you're absolutely right in that this notion of we're just looking out for ourselves and then we're protecting our own privacy, I don't think is going to go a long way. The same is actually true for it always reminds me of like secondhand smoking. So one of the way the moment that we pivoted to saying, well, smoking is actually dangerous and we should be doing something about it, was when we invented the language of secondhand smoking. So it took something where you're hurting other people, not just yourself, that change people's mindsets. And maybe there's a way in which we can do this for like data and privacy as well.
Yeah, applying the golden rule for the online universe that it seems more and more tangible, which can be good and bad, like we discussed. But Sandra, what a pleasure it was discussing with you today. I hope to host you again soon. And I'll put the show notes for your book. I will recommend it. I've been recommended it offline as well. So I appreciate you joining me. It's been an honor.
Thank you so much. Fantastic set of questions. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you, Sandra.